Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 2 on the peoples of Middle-earth. Last time we discussed Christopher Tolkien's prologue to the book, and today we are going to look at his discussion of the prologue to the Lord of the Rings, the development of the prologue to the Lord of the Rings. Lots of really fun stuff that we can learn about. We can sort of see about, not just about how the prologue itself, the Concerning Hobbits, etc. prologue took shape, but what that itself shows us about Tolkien's process. There will be some of the things that we learn from this are things that we've seen already or already concluded. But some of the stuff is really new. For me, one of the things that I was my big take-homes from this chapter were first looking at the way in which Tolkien was wrestling with the tone of the prologue, and not just the prologue, but of the Hobbit matter in The Lord of the Rings itself. And I think we see some really interesting things about that here. So that's one of the things that I'm really interested to see, how by the time he comes to the end of it, where he is with writing The Lord of the Rings and with the sequel to The Hobbit, essentially. So that's one thing I was really interested in. The second thing that I was really interested in was the drama of the emergence of the Great Retcon. That is the new chapter 5 of The Hobbit. And not just the development of the revised story, but the way in which the emergence of the revised story was retroactively worked back, not just into the text of The Hobbit itself, which was partially serendipity, but within the context of The Lord of the Rings. That was probably my highlight of this entire chapter of the Peoples of Middle-earth, because I loved seeing Christopher's analysis of how it actually organically emerged. That was really, really fun. So we're going to spend some time on that. And then at the very end of the chapter, and it was really brief, and maybe you missed it, Christopher Tolkien dropped a bombshell, a Silmarillion bombshell. And he didn't comment on it at all. He just dropped it and walked away. And I think it was a very humble thing for him to have dropped, but has huge implications for me, in my mind, that is, as I'm thinking about the Tolkien's concept of the Silmarillion. Anyway, so that's what's on the agenda for tonight. We'll see how much of that we actually get to. That's a lot of slides, in case you're wondering. So we'll see how many we actually get to. But before we do that, I just wanted to take a moment to return again to talking about this new program that Signum has launched, because it's something I'm really excited about. And I'm going to keep talking about it for a while, because this is something that's quite new, or rather, it's quite old. As Joe Hoffman, one of our regular attendees, was saying at Mythmoot, it's like Signum is turning back the clock to the Middle Ages and doing higher education, like going back to the roots of higher education, basically, where most of what happened in higher education was students coming into a university and basically totally student-driven curriculum. When students would come into a university seeking a mentor, seeking in a much more sort of apprenticeship kind of model, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we are introducing or reintroducing to higher education through Signum University. And in particular, what I'm talking about is the Signum Tutorials program. So if you go to blackberry.signumuniversity.org and click on the Signum Tutorials section, you will see the information on Signum Tutorials. The whole idea here is just as I was describing. This is designed to accommodate anybody who wants to embark on some idiosyncratic course of study, or who has a project that they want to work on. And it can be a big project or a small project. Maybe you are presenting a paper, but this is not something you've done a lot, right? Or maybe you're doing it in a new context. Maybe in your professional context, you've made presentations, in conferences all the time. but you're wanting to do that at, like you're wanting to present a literary paper. And maybe you would like some advice with that, right? Maybe you would like some guidance. There are a lot of projects that people can undertake, scholarly project, creative projects, that it would be really useful to have a mentor assigned to them. Like, and within our master's program, people are working on their master's thesis, and for an entire year's worth of study, they are working with their assigned thesis director, right? We assign them a thesis director, and they're working with that faculty mentor who is, helping to guide them and support them and hold them accountable through that entire process. Wouldn't it be nice if you could get access to exactly that kind of mentorship outside the context of a master's degree, right? Outside the context, not only available to our degree students, but also available to people generally. Yes, Jocelyn, one can request a specific mentor. We won't necessarily, it'll depend on availability, right? How much time they have available, whether your time availability and theirs matches up. So for instance, Jocelyn, I know you're on the West Coast of the US. And so it might be hard to pair you up with like somebody who's based in Europe and is like 8 hours in front of you. Not impossible, but it might be challenging, right? So there might be some reasons in which we can't necessarily accomplish it, right? But you absolutely can request if there's somebody, maybe somebody you've experienced with through our space program or something like that, or have heard a talk from or something. And anyway, so yeah, there are all kinds of possibilities. So anyway, I am very excited about this program. And as I said, it's designed to be enormously flexible. Whether maybe you just want help with writing a paper. There's a paper, even like a term paper, right, for a class that you're working on, that you want writing tutoring on. We can help you with that. Maybe you want subject tutoring. You're trying to learn a language and you're struggling and you want help. And a language coach to coach you through whatever it is, Old Norse, Korean, who knows, right? We can hook you up with that. Or maybe it's a larger thing. Maybe, as I say, you're presenting, you have an idea for a paper you want to present, and you would like to work that out with somebody, spend, a little bit of time getting some feedback and developing those ideas. Maybe you've presented a paper, you've done a presentation and you're thinking, hey, that went really well and I got really good feedback. It would be fun to develop that. Maybe I could develop that into a lecture that you could actually publish with us at Signum, because we do that. And then you could get royalties on it, which would be cool. And we would love to have it available. Or maybe you're thinking of working it up for publication in a scholarly journal. That's cool too. By the way, we can also do that through the collaboratory. But in any case, whatever it is, those kinds of steps are often daunting and almost always are easier to do with somebody's guidance, right? Or maybe there's a big project that you have in mind. Maybe you're writing a novel. Maybe you've always had this idea for a book that you would really like to write. But you're not quite sure where to start. You're not sure how to go about it. Maybe you're working on your novel. You would love somebody who can go along with you through that entire journey, to guide you and advise you and give you feedback and input, and hold you accountable. Any of those things we can do. Any of those things we can do through Signum Tutorials. So just wanted to really to make sure that everybody understands how Signum Tutorials works. If you are, and the tuition for this is really, really small. The tuition is it's space tokens, the same tokens that you spend in our space program. So for somewhere between $120 to $175 a month, you can have, one of our faculty mentors come alongside you and help you with your personal project for as long as you need them to. it just goes month by month, basically, with flexible scheduling based on, what you and your preceptor are able to work out. So all you have to do to get involved in Signum Tutorials is just go to the Signum Tutorials page here, click on the student interest form here. So it's a simple 1-page form just to give us some idea of what you're looking for and what you're doing, and our people will be in touch with you right away. I've been so delighted to see we've had students just pouring into this program so far. We've already matched a whole bunch of people just in the time since we launched it last week. It's been great to see people getting started. We've got a couple of people who are already this week getting started on their tutorials here in July. And we just announced it a week ago. So that's been really, really fun. So I encourage folks to think about it. Signum Tutorials is a very outside the box, outside the lines of normal academia kind of program. And that's really the point of it. It is one of the convictions that we have at Signum University, that too much of the energy of higher education is focused on their rigid degree programs, which are themselves increasingly and now almost overwhelmingly focused on training for particular jobs. That's what all degree programs, undergraduate degree programs now claim to do. When you look at any university and you look at their undergraduate programs, they will this prepares you for this job or this job or this job. Higher education has, over the last several decades, become job training. And that's really sad. There is so much more that higher education has to offer. And there's so much more that people need, that people want. There's so many more learning opportunities available to people if we can break out of those very narrow and rigid ways of looking at higher education. And that's what we're trying to do at Signum. So I encourage you to consider availing yourself of this new, really exciting, really flexible opportunity to get some individual one-on-one instruction and guidance, which can be integrated, by the way, with other things that we do, right? Like it may well be that there will be times if there's a project that you're doing and you'll be working with your mentor and your mentor will say, you know what you should do? You should really audit this class that's being taught in our grad program right now. So let's take a couple months off. You go audit that class and then come back and then we'll continue right after you've done that. Or maybe, take these couple space classes, right? Do some language work, maybe, for instance, in this space series. And then after you've worked on the language, then come back and we'll continue more. It's really flexible. Anyway, that is what we're up to with Signum Tutorials. So again, just go to blackberry.signumuniversity.org, click on tutorials and then the student interest form, and you can get started. All right. Let us get back to the Peoples of Middle-earth here and looking at the prologue. Okay. It is remarkable, Christopher says, that this celebrated account of hobbits goes so far back in the history of the writing of The Lord of the Rings. Its earliest form, entitled Foreword Concerning Hobbits, dates from the period 1938 to 9, and it was printed in The Return of the Shadow. This was a good fair copy manuscript, for which there is no preparatory work extant, but I noticed in my very brief account of it that my father took up a passage concerning Hobbit architecture from the chapter A Shortcut to Mushrooms. Long-standing Mythgard Academy attendees will remember that the passage concerning Hobbit architecture in question is, if I am remembering correctly, the one which also in the original draft included the story about how hobbits throw their dirty dishes out the second-story window. That's that's the passage, right? We will remember that. Comparison with the published prologue to The Lord of the Rings will show that while much of that original version survived, there was a great deal still to come. The entire account of the history of the hobbits, Fellowship of the Ring, pages 11 through 15, in section 1 of the prologue, the whole of section 2 concerning pipeweed, and the whole of section 3 of the Ordering of the Shire, apart from the opening paragraph, while corresponding to section 4 of the Finding of the Ring, there was no more than a brief reference to the story of Bilbo and Gollum. Okay, so several things that we need to understand here. While a lot of the prologue stuff was written and developed later on. Remember his whole premise, Christopher's whole premise here, is he's including this chapter on the development of the prologue because he's arguing it was happening at a very similar time. It was happening like in tandem, essentially, with Tolkien's development of the appendices. So Christopher has kind of lumped the prologue into the appendices. Yes, Yarrow, you're not too late. It's the first slide. Anyhow, this is why Christopher's discussing them all together, right? But he is first of all reminding us of the original version of the Concerning Hobbits. So Tolkien called it a foreword first, and as Christopher notes later on in the chapter, Tolkien continued to call it the foreword for a really long time, even after it had been changed to prologue, because there was another thing written called foreword, right? Remember the foreword to the Lord of the Rings, the one in which he explains that he's cordially disliked allegory, etc., etc. That whole foreword section. So that was written as a foreword. And so now he couldn't call the publishers couldn't call the other thing the foreword also. So they changed it to the prologue. I'm going to consistently call it the prologue throughout because that's what it's called in the published Lord of the Rings. And so when I refer to the prologue, that's what I'm talking about. So even though Tolkien called it the foreword, but whatever. Okay. So Christopher is reminding us that he gave us the original manuscript of the foreword, of the prologue, in the Return of the Shadow. I immediately am inconsistent where I said I wouldn't be, in the Return of the Shadow, which is great. But the first thing that he is reminding us here in the context of the analysis he's going to go on to do is that this began emerging very, very early. Tolkien started writing, he wrote that first draft in 1938 to 39, like within the first year of writing The Lord of the Rings, while the story is still in its early stages of unfolding. And long before, there's still very much of the story that he hadn't written yet. By 1938 to 39, he had gotten through at least the first draft. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head. I was going to try to pass it off like I had a perfect memory of it, but I totally don't. So, but in any case, by 38 to 39, he had certainly completed the first draft of from the beginning of the story, from the long expected party through Rivendell. Those of you who did The Return of the Shadow with me will remember that Tolkien wrote that part of the story, book one, what will become book one, essentially, that he rewrote book one like 5 times. So I am sure he had written the complete book one stuff, gotten to Rivendell, by the time he had written this. So that's interesting. But also remember that, charmingly, when Tolkien got to Rivendell, when he got the ring to Rivendell, he believed and stated in several different contexts that he was halfway through the story, right? He thought it was halfway done. But in any case, while he was still writing and rewriting what he thought was the first version. Thank you, Tirathon. That is a really useful summary there. So by December of 37 through March of 38, he was writing that first phase, the first version to Rivendell. And the second phase, that is going back and doing it again, but not getting all the way from Long Expected Party to Tom Bombadil by November of 38. And then the third phase, that's when he wrote the prologue through to the Mines of Moria, that's like when he stopped by Balin's tomb, which was from December 38 to December of 39. Yeah. Okay. So the Concerning Hobbits, the first draft of the prologue, was written in conjunction with the third phase. Okay. Now, why is this important? Why do we care? We care because this tells us something about what the prologue is and how the prologue relates. The prologue, this shows us in part that the prologue was never conceived as just an extra, like he didn't have to sit down and be like, I think I'm going to write a prologue now, right? I think I'm going to, wouldn't that be nice? What it consisted of from the start, it was conceived as like a receptacle of extra stuff. Again, as those of you who remember The Return of the Shadow and The Treason of Isengard and The War of the Ring will remember, is that Tolkien often got carried away. Tolkien's writing had a lot of momentum, and so he would often get going and he would just let it flow. And of course, when he does, that's when it becomes when it's flowing is when his writing is at his handwriting is at its absolute worst, right? And you may also remember that this tended to happen a lot when people are talking. Frequently, for whatever reason, dialogue would trigger world building for him. Like once the characters started, it wasn't like his narrator who would suddenly wander off and start like rambling about Hobbit architecture. It was his characters who would randomly start talking about Hobbit architecture. Yes, yeah, he did lose control of the discussions quite a bit, Jackie. And so his habit at that point, since there was so much of this Hobbit material in, this whole, what he had been writing this whole time, phase 1 and phase 2, and now he was writing phase 3, when he's doing this, when he's starting the prologue. But anyway, his characters just kept talking, and as they talk, they start to reveal stuff about not only themselves, but about the world, like their society, even things like their architecture and what they do with their dirty dishes. So, but Tolkien was sensible enough, both to, when this stuff was flowing out, let it flow, and cut it out afterwards. But what Tolkien didn't like, what he seemed almost to refuse to do, is just throw it in the bin. And so he had what I've been calling, right, his scrap drawer, right? He would cut it out, but he'd put it in the drawer. And so it was clear to me at the time when we talked about this, and I think that this even Christopher's description here begins to make it clear, that the prologue begins as essentially the place where he can put all of that stuff. The place where he can integrate much, if not quite all, of the content. We never did get the throwing dirty dishes out the window in the published text, did we? So where he can put much of the stuff that he cut. And you'll remember that even individual sentences that he cuts from the text in one place will often creep up. He'll pull them out of the drawer, right, and put them in the text in a different place. And the prologue, and I think also by extension the appendices, this is where things were tending to go. And since he was spending so much time with the hobbits, he had all of this material. The shortcut to mushrooms, like why in a shortcut to mushrooms did the stuff about Hobbit architecture? Simple. Because the hobbits were going across country and talking to each other. And when they did, all this information started coming out. But what did it not include? Well, it didn't concerning pipeweed, wasn't in there. Of the Ordering of the Shire, wasn't in there. And most of the stuff on the Finding of the Ring wasn't in there. So let's learn some more about those things. In this way, So this is Tolkien's early segue here. In this way, the Hobbit escaped and rejoined his companions, 13 dwarves and the wizard Gandalf. Of course, he had quickly guessed that Gollum's ring had somehow been dropped in the tunnels, and that he himself had found it. But he had the sense to say nothing to Gollum. He used the ring several times later in his adventures, but nearly always to help other people. The ring had other powers besides that of making its wearer invisible. But these were not discovered, or even suspected, until long after Bilbo had returned home and settled down again. Consequently, they are not spoken of in the story of his journey. This tale is chiefly concerned with the ring, its powers, and history. So this is from the early version of the prologue, from an early version of the prologue. And this shows you what, when because remember, in the early version, he doesn't do a full synopsis of The Hobbit. You may remember that in the published prologue, there's quite a long summary of Bilbo's journey, especially focusing on his encounter with Gollum and his finding of the ring. That wasn't there, but this is what is. So notice several things here. One, there is no glimmer of the true story, right? There's nothing in here that even hints at a change of the original narrative. Let me pause for a moment to not take for granted that everybody knows what the original narrative was. Very brief summary there. So, of course, in the first edition of The Hobbit, when Bilbo encounters Gollum, he finds the ring, encounters Gollum, Gollum threatens to eat him, they have the riddle game. The original terms of the riddle game are, Gollum says, if I win, I will eat you, but if you win, I will give you a present. And we're told by the narrator that he intends to give him, he has a special ring that he's going to give Bilbo if Bilbo wins. And they have the riddle game, which goes exactly like in the version you all know. And then Bilbo wins in exactly the same way. What have I got in my pocket and all of that? And Gollum loses. And when he loses, Gollum goes back to his island to look for his ring, not to put it on in order to murder Bilbo, but in order to give it to him. And he is very distressed when he finds that his ring is not on his island, not because he's in despair at losing his precious, but because he can't keep his word, and keeping his word and abiding by the rules of the riddle game is super important to Gollum. And so he comes back tremendously apologetic to Bilbo, begging his pardon over and over that he didn't mean to promise him a present that he didn't have, and he doesn't know what happened. And he offers Bilbo some fish instead, and Bilbo's like, no thanks, I'm good. And Bilbo suggests, why don't you show me the way out as a reward instead of a present? And Gollum does so. They depart on perfectly cordial terms, and that is the end of chapter 5 in the original published Hobbit. This not even a synopsis, this description of what happened, not only in the Hobbit, but in the post-Hobbit years. And so Jocelyn, keep in mind, that's not just an early draft version. That is the published version. The first, if you find, should you ever be so lucky as to find a first edition of The Hobbit in actual circulation, that is the published version. That's in 1937. That is the version of The Hobbit that was published. The version that we all know and love was not included until the second edition of The Hobbit in 1950. 1950 is when the new version of chapter 5 that we all know was included. So anyhow, here we see Tolkien planning a paragraph in his prologue with the original story clearly and fully in mind, right? We get no correction. Gollum's ring, he does point out, Bilbo guessed that the ring that he had in his pocket probably was the prize that, the present that Gollum had promised him. But he didn't say anything about it because he was kind of desperate to get out. And so So Bilbo like kind of did cheat in getting a double reward almost, basically. But like technically Gollum didn't give him the ring. He found it himself. So it's fair. Like technically it was okay, but it was like a little bit, sketchy for Bilbo to have done that. But, but it was okay. It's a gray area, Fencing Frog. Absolutely. He used the ring several times later in his adventures, but nearly always to help other people. So Tolkien emphasizes the innocency of Bilbo's usage of the ring, which is interesting because it's not even an issue in The Hobbit itself, right? There's no hint in the first edition of The Hobbit that the ring might be ominous in any way. It's just a really useful magic ring that Bilbo happens to find. But Tolkien here does emphasize that innocency as if that matters, right? That's our first hint, our first segue into the story that we're about to read. That maybe there is something, like he's planting there the seed. Maybe that ring that Bilbo had, maybe there's something dodgy about it. Maybe there's something ominous or dangerous about it. The ring had other powers besides that of making its wearer invisible, but these were not discovered, whatever those powers might be, until long after Bilbo had returned home. Consequently, they're not spoken of in the story of his journey. So I, Tolkien, am filling in the gaps for you, right, between The Hobbit that you've read and this new story you're about to read. This tale is chiefly concerned with the ring, its powers, and history. Notice how cagey he's being. Any hints that the ring is dark and dangerous is really, really indirect here, right? He's playing it real close to the vest so far, just priming you to learn more about the ring, whatsoever that more may end up being. So this is his very first go at connecting the dots about the ring between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Now, we'll come back to that. But I want to come back to the other question, the first question that I was pointing to, which is, what do we learn about Tolkien's attitude towards the hobbits? Because this is, to me, really interesting. Little context first. Many millions of readers have observed the difference in tone between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, right? And even between the beginning of The Lord of the Rings and the end of The Lord of the Rings. And that's understandable, right? Like The Hobbit was sort of one thing. It was designed to be a children's fairy tale. By the time when he set out to write it, of course, what he set out to do was publish the Silmarillion, right? But when his publisher made it perfectly clear that no, thank you, what he really wanted was another Hobbit children's story, Tolkien set out to write a sequel in the same vein. And that's why the long-expected party, which corresponds so perfectly to the unexpected party at the beginning of The Hobbit, has so much of the same, even in the final published version, it has so much of the same tone. And again, those of you who have done the Return of the Shadow with me will remember that the very first draft of that story has even more blatantly the same tone, a sort of narrative tone of The Hobbit. But as I said, that is reduced over time. But now comes the part that I am so fascinated by. On the one hand, Tolkien, his heart wasn't really in the sequel children's book. He didn't want to do that. He wanted to publish the Silmarillion. And so in the end, he had his revenge, didn't he? Right? That is to say, in the end, what he wrote, I think it's, it could be a little bit misleading, but I think in a sense, it's perfectly fair to say that, in 1937, in the fall of 1937, he wanted to publish the Silmarillion. His publisher wanted him to write a sequel to The Hobbit. And what Tolkien ended up doing and publishing was a sequel to the Silmarillion, which is kind of what The Lord of the Rings is, right? So in any case, he kind of sort of got there. He didn't get all the way there. He didn't actually publish the Silmarillion, but he kind of came as close as you could logically do. So as he's writing the Lord of the Rings, it becomes, there comes that magical moment when Trotter, the Hobbit ranger, says, "I will tell you the tale of Tinuvio," and boom, the two worlds come together, and this new Hobbit story that he's writing becomes fully invested in the world of the Silmarillion and the world of the Elder Days, and those two stories become one long story, and the whole thing is transformed. And it is certainly not any longer merely a whimsical children's fairy tale anymore. But, and this is what I find so fascinating, he never stops the Hobbit tone. The Hobbits are still always funny. Not like the main Hobbit characters. It's not like he, even in the early drafts, necessarily was treating Frodo, or Sam, or Merry and Pippin as comic relief. Sam sometimes, a little bit, but, he's not making fun of them. And he, Sam's talk is kind of comical. But in any case, like, he's not just playing hobbits for laughs, not the main Hobbit characters, but the Shire, he does play for laughs. He keeps playing that for laughs. Even at the end, even when he's finished The Lord of the Rings, practically, even when he's coming back and he's doing many partings and the scouring of the Shire and the Grey Havens, he's still playing the Shire for laughs. Look at some examples. It is true that the Took family had once a certain eminence, quite apart from the fact that they were and remained numerous, wealthy, peculiar, and of great social importance. The head of the family had formerly borne the title of the Shire King. But that title was no longer in use in Bilbo's time. It had been killed by the endless and inevitable jokes that had been made about it, in defiance of its obvious etymology. Shire King, obviously. The habit went on, however, of referring to the head of the family as the Took, and of adding, if required, a number, as Isengrim I. So this passage, which emerged in a much later draft of the Prologue, and seemed to be derived from references in the later writing, like in the Scouring of the Shire and stuff. Once again, when he returns to the Shire, characters keep talking and stuff keeps emerging, and this is one of those things that emerged then. And he is... yeah. Anyway, so he makes these dad jokes when he's describing the Shire that he does not do elsewhere. He doesn't play it for laughs, but he does here. The Shire King? Come on. Like, that's an etymological joke, right? You've got the king of the Shire who's called the Shire King, but then it gets changed to the Shire King, and then even just draws attention to the fact that everybody laughs about this, right? Like the Shire King is a hard job, right? Hard to do all that shirking. But that's where Tolkien's mind went when he was dealing with the hobbits and the Shire, again, even in the later stages, when he was in the later stages of writing The Lord of the Rings. Another interesting example, by the way, in the first paragraph, we get another example of the same thing. The new passage in P2, that is the second version, the second manuscript of the Prologue, does not give the time of the year of the free fair on the White Downs, at the lithe that is at midsummer in the published version, and nothing is said of the letter-writing proclivities of the hobbits. To the mention of the name Bounders, my father added, as they were called unofficially. The word unofficially he subsequently removed, thus in this case retaining the joke, but not drawing attention to it. So, in case you've ever wondered, like, have you ever been tempted to snigger at Bounders, right? Like, especially if you know enough British slang to know what that means. So like, if you know, like when the hobbits refer to the Bounders and you've been tempted to giggle, but maybe at times in the past, you've always been unsure, like, am I supposed to be giggling there? Like, is that just like, was that name a joke back then, or did the modern usage of the word bounder, is that a newer thing? Like, does that post date the Lord of the Rings so that like it's now funny, but Tolkien didn't realize it was funny? Answer, he knew it was funny, right? This passage shows Christopher Tolkien is telling us that Tolkien was perfectly well aware of the connotation of the word bounder. It was a joke, just like the shirking, in fact. So that's one that stayed in the text, but notice the change that he makes, like with the shirking. So remember, he draws attention with the shirking that even the hobbits found it funny, and they would tease the Lord of the Shire, right? The Took. They would tease the Took about, like, you're doing great shirking, right? You're the best shirker we've ever had, right? Or whatever. The inevitable jokes that came. And so too, in his first draft of the Bounders reference in the second version of the prologue, he alludes to the fact that it's a joke, as they were called unofficially. Like, he is acknowledging the giggle that the readers might feel welling up in them, right, when they hear that these hobbits are called bounders. When the revision that he made shows that he did not in fact want to remove the joke, but what he did remove was calling official attention to it, right? He removed any reference to the hobbits, thinking that's a joke. Because you see, that would be anachronistic, because the hobbits themselves don't know modern British slang, right? But Tolkien did, and his readers would, at least his British readers, which one can forgive Tolkien for imagining as his primary readers. So Tolkien keeps like this joke that he is sharing with his readers, but he just removes any allusion to the hobbits themselves sharing the joke as well. So anyway, those of you, again, who did, I think this was in Sauron Defeated, but those of you who remember the early drafts of the Scouring of the Shire will remember the frankly off-color dad joke that Tolkien included there, right? Do you remember what the home of the Tooks was called originally? It was called the Took House, which was meant to be pronounced Tookus, which was a slang term for your butt. And he included an off-color reference to being kicked in the Tookus. It's a Yiddish term, Arthur? Well, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. Anyway, like, point is, like, so that's another joke that Tolkien put into the first draft of the Scouring of the Shire again. So like, this is Frodo is coming home from Mount Doom, right? The whole story has been written at that point. And he is still as soon as he gets back in the Shire, it starts coming out again. All of this hobbitry, all of these dad jokes, right? Yes, they thrashed him in the Tookus. Yes, that's it. That's the line, JJ. They've caught a ruffian or two and thrashed him in the Tookus. Yeah, exactly. In the Took house, of course. That's all he meant. You see the joke, right? It's a spanking joke. It's an off-color spanking joke that Tolkien made. And so that Tolkien had this impulse and that it did not go away is fascinating to me. fascinating to me that in a sense, although he objected to might be too strong. Although he didn't want to continue. He had fun writing The Hobbit. He loved The Hobbit when he was writing it. He had a great time writing The Hobbit, but he felt like he was done with that. Like, he didn't have another children's book in him. He didn't know what he wanted to. He put everything in The Hobbit that he could ever have wanted to put in children's books, he said, and didn't have anything left over. And he didn't want to go there. And yet that tone, he never lost it. So I think we need to be careful. I think that I myself have been too sloppy in the past. That is to say, too sloppy in saying the reason for the shift in tone right around chapter 3, right? Round about the thinking fox, is when the tone of The Lord of the Rings becomes much more serious, and we never really go back to the more Hobbit-like tone of the first chapters. I don't think that's true. Or that is to say, I don't think that is only an artifact, a relic of the fact that when he wrote those chapters originally, he thought he was writing a sequel to The Hobbit. And so that's why his tone was like that. That is still involved, but it's not the only explanation, because that would not at all explain why that tone keeps returning and cropping up again when he gets back to the Shire at the end and knows full well he is no longer writing a sequel to The Hobbit. Right? There is no version of reality in which Tolkien, while writing the Scouring of the Shire at the end of the story, thinks he's still writing a story in the tone and, idiom of The Hobbit. He's already written the other book, right? And yet the tone comes back, or at least it creeps in. And now you may say, well, hang on, I've read The Scouring of the Shire and I've read The Grey Havens, and the tone is not the same as in the early chapters. It is different from those. Yeah, it is. But again, I think the primary reason for that is that he was more assiduous in editing those. One of the things that you may also remember from those discussions of, I think it was Scouring of the Shire, is where I think it was Sauron Defeated is where the Scouring of the Shire drafts were published. But I might be wrong about that. Might be War of the Ring. In any case, so you may remember that in the very first version in the Thrasham and the Tookis draft of the Scouring of the Shire, he also had Frodo coming back and being the military hero. Frodo was like the martial champion of the hobbits, and ends the Battle of Bywater with a one-on-one boss fight against a very large and intimidating orc named Sharky, who was the leader of the ruffians. Tolkien changed that because he realized that that's not going to work. Frodo is too changed. Frodo is not going to come back and establish himself in the Shire by kicking butt and taking names. And so the revision to the published text, in which he has Frodo not only not fighting himself, but going around and trying to prevent as much violence as possible, to especially try to prevent as much killing as possible. That was the new direction, which came in at about the same time that the reintroduction of Saruman's character in the Scouring. But anyway, the point is that shift in tone, even just the shift in tone in Frodo's own actions, right? The way in which not just the seriousness, not just the solemnity, but the sadness, the tragedy of the end of the Quest of the Ring, the way that gets carried forward through Frodo's character into the last chapters, I think they worked upon Tolkien such that in his revisions, he removed much more of that comedy. But notice with bounders what we see. It gets removed, but he cut it out, but he put it in the drawer, right? And he puts it in the prologue. He keeps it in the prologue. Some of it, at least. Not the shirking, but he keeps the bounders. So I do think that the primary reason... Well, let me revise what I was about to say. I think that we can see a couple reasons why the first chapters of the Lord of the Rings and the last chapters of the Lord of the Rings don't match. And that is because the tone of the whole story had changed. The tone of the characters themselves had changed. And he could no longer treat everything in so light a fashion while Frodo was standing right there, essentially. And also there is the factor that he was, in fact, thinking about writing the sequel to The Hobbit in the early chapters, so he was far less, and he had no inhibitions at all, right, while writing the first draft. But he also, for the reasons that I was just describing, had more reason to edit that tone out of the last version. But the critical point that I want to come back to and not lose is that this tone, this whimsical narrative tone, the tone which is much more like the Hobbit tone than it is like the mainstream Lord of the Rings tone, was something that never abandoned his description of the Shire. It's like every time Tolkien went back to the Shire, he went back into Hobbit frame of mind to some extent. His brain just seemed to go there. His brain seemed to think of the Hobbits collectively, not the characters, not Merry and Pippin and Frodo and Sam, but the Hobbits collectively as comical. Comical in the way that the Hobbit as a story was comical. And that is a fascinating thing to notice. And as I say, I think that I have underestimated this, my whole life. Essentially, I'm just rereading this chapter again and working through this stuff for you guys and with you guys has really kind of pushed me to rethink my thinking on that. Second paragraph I included for kind of dating reasons. It seems to me all but certain that this new element in the text, that is the bounder stuff, is to be associated with the emergence of the sheriffs in the chapter The Scouring of the Shire, where the office is shown to have been long established before any of this began, as the Sheriff Robin Smallborough said to Sam. The fact that the term Thane had not yet emerged does not contradict this, for that came in very late. I have concluded that Book 6 of The Lord of the Rings was written in 1948. 1948. So in 1948, he is still... So when the hobbits are talking, right? During the Scouring of the Shire, when Sam is talking to Robin Smallborough, guess what happens? They keep talking, right? And when they're talking, stuff comes out like it always does. A lot of these things about the ordering of the Shire, the significance of the Thane, the sheriffs, the bounders, all of this came out of Robin Smallborough's mouth. He cut most of it from the main text, but it goes into the prologue. So a lot of this ordering of the Shire stuff emerged in 1948 while he's writing the Scouring of the Shire. So throughout, he has been cutting things when people talk too much. But he's been keeping them in his drawer. And we see as the prologue is growing and growing, as it has more and more of these things given to it. And of course, it makes perfect sense that this prologue about hobbits would have been written primarily in 1938 to 39 and in 1948. Why? Because that's when he was writing the two Shire bits in the story. Phase 1, Phase 2, the early chapters of Book 1 with the hobbits, And then he goes away and goes on a long and to him quite unexpected journey, right through Moria and through Lorien and through Fangorn and Rohan and Gondor, none of which he imagined happening, and Mordor, and then back again, and now he's in the Shire again. And those hobbits are talking again, and they're saying silly things, and they're spouting off on, whether it be architecture or politics or, law enforcement structures, they just keep talking. And their material's getting cut and it's getting put into the prologue, both at the beginning and at the end. And yes, Jackie and David Michael, a couple of people are talking about the references that in Tolkien's letters, when he says that he and Christopher both were very amused by the hobbitry, right? By Hobbit talk. That's plain, right? It's plain that Tolkien was very amused by it. But I think that reference in that letter doesn't do justice to the situation. It doesn't do justice to thrash him in the tuchus. That is to say, it isn't just that Tolkien was himself amused by the way that hobbits talk in parallel to the way, for instance, in which Frodo is amused by the way that Sam talks, right, as he tells him on the stairs of Cirith Ungol. It's not just that. It's not just that Tolkien enjoyed Hobbit dialogue. He did, but there's more than that, right? It's not just that he himself found it amusing. It's that he is including his own jokes in it. Jokes at the expense of the hobbits. Jokes outside of Hobbit dialogue. The Bounder's joke is not a joke that the hobbits themselves are making. It's his joke. He's laughing at the hobbits. He's not making them say funny things. He's laughing at them. So yes, he enjoys hobbitry. Yes, he enjoys the Hobbit talk. But there's more going on than that. And it's fascinating to see. Okay. Speaking of that drawer, I just invite you to think about this. Hang on a second. Let me get out a little aid here. And hang on. Look at me. I'm looking for the appendices, and what I want is the prologue. Part 3 of the first part of the prologue. Part 3 is of the ordering of the Shire. Concerning pipeweed. So, Christopher tells us, for the history of the passage on pipeweed, which began as a lecture on the subject delivered by Merry to Theoden in the ruined gates of Isengard, see Volume 8. After much development, my father marked it, put into forward. Let me read that last sentence again. After much development, my father marked it, put into forward. It's noticeable. Anybody who knows the text well and then reads the prologue will recognize the exact quotation of Merry's words to Theoden in the ruins of Isengard, right? There is another astonishing thing about hobbits of old that must be mentioned, an astonishing habit. They imbibed or inhaled through pipes of clay or wood the smoke of the burning leaves of a herb which they called pipeweed or leaf, a variety probably of Nicotiana. And then we get the rest of the paragraph describing the mystery of it. And then there's the paragraph which segues into a quotation from Merry. This is the one art that we can certainly claim to be our own invention, right? And he gives some, all accounts agree that Tobald Hornblower of Longbottom in the South Farthing first grew the true pipeweed in his garden. And then the next paragraph begins, how old Toby came by the plant is not recorded. That's, of course, the quotation. How old Toby came by the plant is where Gandalf cuts him off in the published text, right? This goes on for 2 more fat paragraphs, right? It's a page and a half of text in the published prologue. This extract from Merry's concerning pipeweed section in his herblore of the Shire. That this emerged organically within the text. Merry started talking, right? Theoden remarks on the fact that they're smoking, and Merry immediately rises to the occasion and starts telling Theoden about the history of smoking. Once we've seen Tolkien's habits, we should be entirely unsurprised to discover that Tolkien would have gotten carried away at that point, right? That once Merry started talking about smoking, this entire history of how hobbits came to smoke tobacco would emerge. That's totally unsurprising. That it got cut almost wholesale from the text and put into the drawer, and then from the drawer into the prologue, also par for the course, right? Exactly what we should expect at this point. But here's the thing that amuses me most. After much development, my father marked it put into forward. Do you see what that means? That means in his draft, Tolkien not only wrote this and said, no, it's not just that he got carried away and wrote this. He got carried away and wrote this in the Two Towers, right? In the Isengard chapter, he got carried away and wrote this, and then he developed it. He continued after much development. So presumably something quite like probably not like the opening lines, which are more in the tone of the prologue. There is another astonishing thing about hobbits of old, right? Like Merry wouldn't have said that, not in those words, to Theoden. But I'm guessing that everything that's given as a quotation, from when we first get quotations from Merry, this is the one art that we can certainly claim to be our own invention. When hobbits first began to smoke is not known. All the legends and family histories take it for granted. For ages, I think that those entire 3 paragraphs that come next, which is almost an entire page of text, Tolkien not only wrote the first version of and then was like, nah, I gotta cut that, but he revised it and developed it. And only after he revised it and developed it, so that whole section, I think we have every reason to imagine that entire page worth of text, Merry originally said to Theoden in Isengard. And then only after, not after he did it, but after he developed it and revised it and expanded it, does Tolkien write a note to himself and say, yeah, let's put this in the forward, right? This Merry goes on way too long. We can't have a whole paragraph, a whole page, rather. Seriously, it's like, I don't even know how many words this is. It's like 150, 200 words. It's a bunch, right? Probably more. So the impulse to cut it and put it in the drawer and put it straight into the plate. It just do not stop in the drawer, go straight to the prologue, right? That impulse was late in coming, right? And I find it delightful and amusing to find how late it was in coming. And Green Great Dragon, I totally agree with you that when Gandalf, when in the final version of the text, Gandalf interrupts Merry and says to Theoden, you don't know your danger. I agree with you that in this context, we can hear Gandalf's words as like self-talk almost by Tolkien, right? That he doesn't know his own danger, right, of getting carried away. He was putting his readers into danger. But anyways, I just the whole thing, like that, knowing this, imagining that those 3 fat paragraphs, not just the like one sentence and then one fragment that Merry actually says in the published text, but imagining Merry holding forth for an entire page of lecture about the history of smoking before he's interrupted or before it ends. And then knowing how it in fact goes with Gandalf interrupting and stuff, it makes it like 10 times funnier. I think that's really awesome. Okay. Here's another thing that was particularly interesting to me, because it has to do with the Hobbit and with the Lord of the Rings relationship to the Hobbit. This is in the first version of the prologue. And yet plainly they must be relatives of ours. This is not the, this is only the beginning of the segue into what I was just referring to. Hang on, we'll get there. And yet plainly they must be relatives of ours, nearer to us than elves are, or even dwarves. For one thing, they spoke a very similar language or languages, and liked or disliked much the same things as we used to. I loved used to. What exactly the relationship is would be difficult to say. To answer that question, one would have to rediscover a great deal of the now wholly lost history and legends of the earlier days, and that is not likely to happen, for only the elves preserve any traditions about the earliest days, and their traditions are mostly about themselves, not unnaturally. The elves were much the most important people of those times. This, of course, is one of the several places in the published text where Tolkien is rubbing his publisher's nose in the fact that they won't publish the Silmarillion, right? I love that, like, you hear it, right? To answer that question, one would have to rediscover a great deal of the now wholly lost history and legends of the early days. Like, isn't it tragic that we don't have the lost history and legends of the early days? Man, I think we can all agree that that's a complete tragedy, isn't it? And it's just, unfortunately, that's not likely to be rediscovered on account of certain publishers won't agree to publish. I mean, I love the shade that he works into this. But all of this is premised on the lost history of the hobbits. And this relates to two questions which we're going to look at. One, which we'll come back to in a little while, which is like, what are hobbits and our relationships with them? Like, let's stop and think about that for a few minutes. But we'll do that in a few minutes, not right away. The second thing is about the hobbit's relationship to history. What hobbit history do we actually know? And you might say, well, but hang on, we got some in The Hobbit, right? So the question is, how much of that counts? And the immediate answer seems to be less than you think, or less than we might guess. Christopher says, the original text of the chapter, The Scouring of the Shire, had no reference to the Battle of Greenfields. So ended the fierce Battle of Bywater, the only battle ever fought in the Shire. In blatant contradiction to The Hobbit. In the second text, my father repeated this, but altered it as he wrote to the last battle fought in the Shire and the only battle since the Greenfields, 1137, away up in the North Farthing. It seems a good guess that, as with the passage concerning the sheriffs, the appearance of the Battle of Greenfields in the prologue soon after this is to be associated with the writing of the Scouring of the Shire. So you may remember that there's a reference to the Battle of Greenfields in the prologue. Christopher is here citing this as an instance by which we can tell when that bit was put into the prologue. And that's interesting. That it would have been, that reference to the Battle of Greenfields was clearly not put in until 1948, because it's at that point when he's still writing a version of the Scouring of the Shire in which the Battle of Bywater is the only battle ever fought in the Shire. But I think that there's a second really interesting thing that we can see here, and that is Tolkien's assessment of The Hobbit. There is no doubt that Bolroer Took fought a battle with goblins within the Shire and lopped off the head of their leader, right? And thus won the battle and invented the game of golf at the same time. That is well attested in The Hobbit, right? So what does it suggest? That Tolkien, clearly not forgetting about it. I don't see any reason to think that Tolkien has just lapsed on it. It's theoretically possible, I suppose, but I don't think so. I think it suggests that Tolkien was not going back to The Hobbit as a source of history for hobbits, even for the Shire itself. And in a sense, I think we can understand that. How does the Battle of Greenfields come up? Well, it's the golf joke. It's another dad joke thing that he's doing, right? The golf king, the golf thimble, the king of the goblins, right? Or Green Great Dragon, exactly. In the very first draft of The Hobbit, Fingolfin, he recycled the name Fingolfin to make the golf joke. The Lord of the Goblins was named Fingolfin. Yeah, so that he could make the golf pun. But then he changed his mind about that and changed his name to Golfimble. But anyway, the entire reference to that battle was a joke, a dad joke, right? About inventing golf. And so Tolkien does not seem, his impulse here seems to be not to take it particularly seriously, not to treat it, that is that very clear historical reference in The Hobbit, as an actual historical reference, as real world building. He changes his mind about that, and he does integrate. In the second draft of The Scouring of the Shire, he does integrate the reference to the Battle of the Greenfields. So he made the decision that the Hobbit history can stand, but it wasn't a no-brainer. It wasn't obvious. And that's really interesting, especially as it touches on this whole dad joke thing, right? That there's this history of not taking hobbits seriously. There's this tendency that Tolkien himself has to, I don't want to say make fun of the hobbits, because that's not quite fair. He's not mocking them or something like that, but just basically to use hobbits and hobbit talk and hobbit events, even serious events like battles, as premises for dad jokes rather than as serious history. And so now when he's writing The Scouring of the Shire, he's got the whole Lord of the Rings written, right? And it's linked to the Silmarillion lying behind it. And from that point of view, it seemed to him not a no-brainer that he was going to integrate that particular dad joke into the serious history of his world. I think that that's interesting. And Jackie, you were right. Yes, Jackie is emphasizing the reason she was quoting the letter earlier was primarily to emphasize that his two primary critics advised him to cut back on the hobbitry, that nobody else was as amused by it as he was. And yes, Jackie, that is interesting, especially since we see the indifferent degree to which he complied with that, right? And the impulse certainly did not diminish, in fact. But anyway, so yes, his hesitation, is the Battle of Greenfields real history, or is it just a joke? The fact that he's asking that question is really interesting. Now back to the other question about hobbits and their relationship with us. Christopher says, returning briefly to the manuscript P5, that is the 5th version of the prologue, I have not yet mentioned that in this text as originally written, the old passage in Prologue 1 concerning the hobbits of the Marish, quote, the hobbit breed was not quite pure, or no purebred hobbit had a beard, still preserved in the revision of Prologue 2, was now altered. The hobbits of that quarter, the East Farthing, were rather large and heavy-legged. They wore dwarf boots in muddy weather, but they were stores in the most of their blood, as was shown by the down that some grew on their chins. However, the matter of these breeds and the Shire lore about them we must leave aside for the moment. So, in the 5th version of the manuscript, which is getting now much closer, I think, wasn't it? Basically, the final version is essentially P7. There was P6 was the next revision, and then from there he made corrections, which basically brought it to the final version. So we're getting close. By version 5 of the Prologue, we're getting close to the published version. And in that version, he more fully integrates all this Store, Harfoot, Falahide stuff. But the thing that I find most interesting is not what he changed to, but what he changed from. The Hobbit breed was not quite pure. No purebred Hobbit had a beard. In what way was the Hobbit breed impure? With whom were the Hobbits mixing? Exactly. According to his thinking in the earlier versions. Jackie, I agree. It maybe dwarves on account of the beards. That seems possible. But Arthur, that's exactly what I was thinking too. The racial intermarriage of hobbits is alluded to in chapter 1 of The Hobbit, with the reference to this story, which may or may not be true, that one of the Tooks took a fairy wife, that is to say, married an elf. So this is possible. And again, in the context of that passage about their relationship with us, in the world in which he's still saying things like this, talking about the Hobbit breed being not quite pure, that referencing the fact that hobbits did in fact like intermarry and interbreed with other peoples, is he actually suggesting? Again, let me go back to it for a second. This is version 1. This is in the purebred stuff that's in here in this version. When he says, they must be relatives of ours. What does he mean by that? I think that he, when he says that same thing, basically in the published prologue, we tend, I think, to think about that in some kind of like quasi evolutionary sense, right? That like hobbits must be relatives of ours in the same way that like maybe chimpanzees must be relatives of ours, right? That is to say, we have common ancestors. That we and hobbits have common ancestors seem to be like, that's always the impression I've gotten about how most Tolkien fans understand that line about hobbits must be relatives of ours. But I wonder, in the context of the first version of the prologue, if that's what he meant. What exactly the relationship is would be difficult to say. I don't mean literally. That's why I said quasi-evolutionary. I'm not suggesting that he was like him, that he would himself have envisioned a Darwinian explanation. But I think that many of his readers do, is what I'm saying. My description there was not what I think was in Tolkien's mind. What I was saying was what seems to me, from all that I've heard in every conversation I've had, seems to be in the mind of most Tolkien readers. No, what was in Tolkien's mind when he wrote that is exactly the question I'm asking. And I think that by relatives, he may mean something closer. Yeah, JJ, that probably, rather than bringing up Darwin, that's a better way of talking about what I'm describing, what I was trying to describe. JJ says, I always understood it that they're relatives of ours in the same sense that Egyptians are relatives of Germans. Yes. And Fencing Frog, there are lots of really great reasons why you get a little uncomfortable when he speaks of a species being pure. But yeah, I understand. But notice there doesn't seem to be any necessary like advocacy for purity. nor criticism of lack of purity, just an observation that they do in fact interbreed. And it is possible, Jackie, that the increased talk about racial purity, in the world as a whole during the 40s may have involved why he changed it. It's possible. Can't rule it out. But anyway, the point is that my point is, I wonder to what extent the idea of hobbits interbreeding with anybody else, dwarves, elves, humans, was in Tolkien's imagination when he wrote this paragraph, and perhaps remained in his imagination. He stopped using the word pure, right? He cut that out only a couple drafts in. For whatever reasons, he chose not to say it that way anymore. Maybe he didn't like it either. But it doesn't change the question in my mind. And I bring this up because this seems to me to raise this question. Remember, we came across this many times earlier on in the history of Middle-earth, examples of times when Tolkien, and remember Christopher warned about this explicitly, just because Tolkien removes a reference in a later draft doesn't mean he's not thinking it anymore, necessarily. Sometimes the change of something in a later draft will reflect a change of idea. But sometimes it just is because he decided he didn't want to say it that way, or he didn't want to spell it out that way, but he's still thinking it. And I think that there's a bunch of examples like that. And I wonder if this is one. I wonder if the published prologue, if behind the published prologue is an idea that hobbits might have intermarried with dwarves, and that in later generations, hobbits have been interbreeding with humans, and that's why they're relatives of ours. In that sense also, not just in the sense that we all come from the same sort of mortal human family at some point, which metaphysically speaking seems almost certain to be true of hobbits. But maybe they're relatives in a different sense. Now, the fact that he expanded on the Stor, Harfoot, Falahide thing does imply that maybe his thinking was in fact changing. That instead of thinking about, some of them have beards because they interbred with dwarves, and he's like, no, they just had beards because they were Stors. And the Stors had, were beard adjacent, right? So it's possible. That seems to me to be a pretty strong argument to imply that no, his thinking was in fact changing. But I'm still not entirely sure that that's the case. Anyway, so I don't have any conclusions to offer, I don't think there's proof here either way. I just think it's an interesting question to be asking. Now, let's get back to the retcon before we're done. Maybe we can finish up the retcon, and then we can drop the bombshell and then leave. I'll just drop it and walk away like Christopher did. Okay. So remember where we were. Let's go back for a second, just real quick. Early segue. So remember, he was operating initially from completely within the framework of the published first edition Hobbit. The only thing he was doing was hinting very gently at the fact that more was discovered later, and the ring had other powers of some kind. And you're going to learn more about that in this book. Okay. The text of P6, this is a late version now. The text of P6. So remember, when is P6? The sixth version of the prologue. Post Scouring of the Shire. Post 90, so this is like 1948, 1949 is around when this is, right? Remember when the second edition of The Hobbit was published? 1950. And remember the story. Tolkien rewrote chapter 5 of The Hobbit, shared it with his publisher, just to be like, hey, what do you think of this? And his publisher kept it. And when the second edition of The Hobbit was published, it appeared. And Tolkien didn't know about it until like he saw it in proofs. Tolkien did not submit it to his publisher, that is the revised second edition of Chapter 5 of The Hobbit that we all know and love. He didn't actually submit it to his publisher as a replacement of the old chapter. He was just like, I've been toying with this. What do you think of it? And the publisher, without comment, was just included it. And Tolkien got the proofs and was like, holy cow, you put the new one in there. And then he was like, all right, let's do it. So he did not plan that. But that doesn't mean he didn't mean it. It meant he thought he was going to have to manage that entirely in the prologue material and in chapter 2. He knew the story had to change. By the time he had written The Lord of the Rings, he knew that the original chapter 5 of The Hobbit would never do. He was like, that Gollum would never do that. Gollum would never actually intend to give the ring away and then just be like super apologetic that he couldn't, right? Like, that is not Gollum. So he knew that wasn't going to fly, but he thought he was going to have to massage that from within the narrative only. Okay. The text of Prologue 6 differed still from the published form in a number of ways, mostly very minor. The text was not yet divided into 4 numbered sections, though the final ordering and succession of the parts was now reached, and the concluding section on the finding of the ring was still the original story. So in the 6th version, remember, so this is before he got the huge surprise in 1950 that the new Hobbit was going to be published. He thought the first edition was going to be out there. So his 6th version of the prologue still contains a synopsis of the original first draft of the Hobbit story. This was derived with some rewriting from the text of Prologue 2, but with a notable addition. After the reference to Gollum saying that he had got the ring as a birthday present long ago, there follows, Bilbo might indeed have wondered how that could be, and still more, why Gollum should be willing to give such a treasure away if his case had been less desperate. And if in fact Gollum had ever given him the present. He did not, for when he returned to his island to fetch it, the ring was not to be found. This part then concludes much as in sorry, I shouldn't have included that in the indented part. This is Christopher again. This part then concludes much as in Prologue 2, with the addition of a passage about Bilbo's secrecy concerning the ring and his disposal of Sting in the coat of mail, ending, and the years passed while he wrote in his leisurely fashion the story of his journey. Okay, so okay. So what do we see here? What we see here, I've called this the transitional retcon, right? This is Tolkien beginning to do retcon when he thinks he's got to manage it all himself. And the way that he does it is, so notice there are 2 elements that he adds to the story first. First, he admits when writing the synopsis that Bilbo had his doubts that everything was as it seemed. He's not saying that Bilbo lied about the story. He's saying that Bilbo might have misinterpreted events, potentially. After all, Gollum said he was going to give him the present, but it never actually came to it. Would he have done? Maybe not. So those are the seeds of doubt that Bilbo has about the original story. So you can see how this is a version of the retcon without the second edition. If the true story, right, if the second version never had existed, how he was going to make the first one work. So fascinating, right? Bilbo having doubts. And then the other addition was Bilbo's own secrecy. Not secrecy about the story, but secrecy about the ring itself, right? And not wanting to tell Gandalf about it too much. Okay. I want to come back to this. Yeah, I want to hang on. I'll come back to that one. I want to continue with the retcon thread. From this point, however, there are two texts. In one of these, the original story now becomes, so this is post 1950, right? Now the second edition of The Hobbit has been thrust upon him, and he's like, holy cow. From this point, there are two texts. In one version of these, the original story, now become Bilbo's untrue version, is not mentioned at all. And the text moves at once from Gollum. So this is, sorry, he's referring here to two texts of The Lord of the Rings. As this is not just about the prologue now. It's about chapter 2. Because Tolkien wrote chapter 2 without knowing that the revised Hobbit was coming out. So when the revised Hobbit comes out, he rewrites stuff. So, okay, in one of these, the original story is not mentioned at all. And the text moves at once from Gollum's cry of hatred to of Bilbo's later adventures. Little more need be said here. Sorry, I'm getting all confused. So that's one version of the prologue where he's like, I'm just skipping it. But my father was in doubt whether or not to say anything in the prologue about Bilbo's doctored accounts of the events. For at the point where the actual story ends, we hates it forever. He subsequently added in this text a direction to a note on a separate sheet, which was apparently written quite independently. In this note, which was the origin of the passage concerning the two versions in the Fellowship of the Ring, page 22, the satisfying explanation of the difference in the story as told in the two editions of The Hobbit is probably seen at its emergence. So let's talk about that note on a separate sheet. Here's the passage, the extra passage that he wrote to The Shadow of the Past. Gandalf has just talked about how he had to put the fear of fire in Gollum. And Gollum told his whole story. I already suspected much of it, Gandalf says to Frodo. Indeed, I had already suspected something that I am sure has never occurred to you. Bilbo's story was not true. What do you mean? Cried Frodo. I can't believe it. Well, this is Gollum's account. Bilbo's reward for winning was merely to be shown a way out of the tunnels. There was no question of a present, least of all of giving away his precious. Gollum confesses that he went back to his island to get it, simply so as to kill Bilbo in safety, for he was hungry and angry. But as Bilbo had already picked up the ring, he escaped. And at the last Gollum knew of him, and the last Gollum knew of him was when he crept up behind and jumped over him in the dark. That is much more like Gollum. But it is quite unlike Bilbo not to tell the true tale, said Frodo. And what was the point of it? Unlike Bilbo, yes. But unlike Bilbo with the ring? No, I am afraid not. You see, half unknown to himself, he was trying to strengthen his claim to be its rightful owner. It was a present, a prize he had won, much like Gollum and his birthday present. The two were more alike than you will admit, and both their tales were improbable and hobbit-like. My dear Frodo, elven rings are never given away as presents or prizes. Never. You are a hobbit yourself, or you would have doubted the tale as I did it once. Okay. So this seems to me to be the version, like a passage that Tolkien wrote when he still thought he had to do all the retcon himself, when the true tale had not come out. Frodo's own surprise here. What do you mean? I can't believe it. Bilbo's surprised to learn that the story he'd always known was not the actual true version of the story, I think seems to me to be Tolkien. Tolkien seems to have designed this as like basically to mediate the reader's own surprise and confusion. Because assuming that the reader of Chapter 2 of The Lord of the Rings will have read The Hobbit also, they also know the story about Gollum saying that he would give Bilbo the present, right? The ring. The reader is going to be very surprised when Gandalf, that's a bomb Gandalf's dropping there. Bilbo's story was not true. And the reader reels back in shock. What? The Hobbit's wrong? The Hobbit's a lie? And the reader has Frodo to be their mouthpiece here. And Gandalf lays it out. Yes, Bilbo lied. And this is why he lied. It's unlike Bilbo, but it's not unlike Bilbo with the ring. This is evidence of how the ring was corrupting him. So you can see how it's all working, right? This is the note. This is the rider that he was going to add into the text in order to integrate, to do his retcon, right? But he changes his mind when he knows in 1950. So yeah, 1951 was the date of the release of the second edition of The Hobbit, but he saw it in the proofs in 1950. So in 1950, Tolkien knew that the true version of Chapter 5 was going to get published and be out there publicly. In the following final typescript of the chapter, the rider is not present, but my father added a note at this point, "Take in rider," and then struck it out. It was clearly at this time that he wrote the note referred to above, alternative if the only reference to this is made in Chapter 2. He meant if no more was to be said of the matter in Chapter 2, then Gandalf's words, "I put the fear of fire on him and wrung the true story out of him bit by bit with much sniveling and snarling," i.e. without the rider just given. If that rider was to be rejected, then a passage on the subject must be given in the prologue. This was ultimately his decision, and the second of the two texts, appended to page 6, is exactly as it stands in the published prologue. Now it is a curious fact that this is not the story as Bilbo first told it to his companions. So Tolkien decides to move this from live in the conversation between Gandalf and Frodo back into the prologue. And I myself suspect, this is not Christopher's, this is my theory now. I suspect that this is connected with him seeing the proofs. That when he knew that The Hobbit was going to be available, like the new version of The Hobbit was going to be available, he knew that he didn't have to break the news from scratch to people. Though the way that he does it in the prologue, now it is a curious fact that this is not the story as Bilbo first told it to his companions, still clearly does cover the fact that many of his readers may not have reread The Hobbit since it came out in the second edition before they read it. But I think that we're seeing him make these adjustments to his planned retcon. The shifting of the retcon from the middle of the drama with Gandalf and Frodo back into the prologue is really dialing it back. And you'll remember that not only that, but in the final version, in the final typescript of the chapter, the final version of The Shadow of the Past, not only do they not have that conversation, but Frodo is actively not surprised, right? Yeah. Remember that in the published text, Gandalf asks Frodo if, about Bilbo. Frodo mentions that Bilbo told him the story of the ring, how he got it and how he won it. And Gandalf makes that comment, "Which story, I wonder?" And Frodo casually immediately says, "Oh, not the story that he wrote in his book and told the dwarves, right? He told me the true story not long after I came here, right?" You had best know, Frodo, my lad. Remember that whole passage? So he took out the one rider, but he added another one. He added another section in which Frodo was unsurprised because Frodo already knew. And that's where I think we see Tolkien's own, like the change made when he knows the new chapter 5 is going to be published in the second edition of The Hobbit. Because Frodo is the stand-in for the reader in both cases. If this moment in the story is going to be the first time the reader has to process the fact that The Hobbit was a lie, he has Frodo be shocked too, to mediate their shock, to be their representative. But once it's out there in public, before The Lord of the Rings is published, then instead he has Frodo model their casual familiarity. Oh, yeah, no, not that old story. I know the real story because I've read the second edition, right? Yeah. So I think that's where we can, and again, all of this is happening really close together. The finalization of the prologue, the finalization of the text of The Lord of the Rings in TypeScript versions, and the surprise inclusion of the new chapter 5 in the second edition of The Hobbit. All of that is kind of coming together at the same time. Okay, hang on. Before I do the bombshell, because we're done. We're just in time for it. Let me go back to the reader that I skipped. There is also an index of names struck out with explanations and strange words. This is a passage from the prologue. This is Tolkien talking about the appendices. And a table of days and dates. For those who are curious and like such lore, some account is given in an appendix of the languages, the alphabets, and the calendars that were used in the Westlands in the Third Age of Middle-earth. But such lore is not necessary, and those who do not need it or desire it may neglect it, and even the names they may pronounce as they will. Wait, hang on. Let me read that again. And even the names they may pronounce as they will, says Tolkien. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, J.R.R. I will keep that in mind. Some care has been given to the translation of their spelling from the original alphabets, and some notes on the sounds that are intended are offered. Notes on the sounds that are intended? Do you see what that means? I think he's referring to the accents. That's why there are accents over some of the vowels or dots over some of the vowels. The pronunciation guides. And so he's trying to convey notes on the sounds that are intended by when the change of alphabet has happened, right? So when the story is translated from the Westron and transliterated from the Quenya, or from the Tengwar into the Latin alphabet and into English, then, some changes had to be made. But not all are interested in such matters, and many who are not may still find the account of these great and valiant deeds worth the reading. It was in that hope that this long labor was undertaken, for it has required several years to translate, select, and arrange the matter of the Red Book of Westmarch in the form in which it is now presented to men of a later age, one no less darkling and ominous than were the great years 1418 and 1419 of the Shire long ago, wrote Tolkien in the 40s, right? Yes. Okay. So notice how Tolkien is writing all of this in the persona. He's now fully developed the persona of the modern scholar who has found and edited and translated the texts which derive ultimately from the matter of the Red Book of Westmarch, right? We see that persona developing over the course of the revisions of the prologue. Now, we get to the bombshell. What I found to be this is a Silmarillion bombshell. This is a Christopher Tolkien bombshell. That is not a bombshell by Christopher, but to Christopher and Christopher's editing of the Silmarillion. Here we go. Ready? The note on Shire records entered in the second edition of The Lord of the Rings. In one of his copies of the first edition, my father noted, "Here should be inserted note on the Shire records." But he wrote against this later. "I have decided against this. It belongs to preface to the Silmarillion." Boom. Do you see why that's so important? Tolkien thought that the note on the Shire records should not be included in the prologue to The Lord of the Rings. Why? Because he felt that the note on Shire records, all that stuff about Findegil King's Rider and the West Book, the Red Book of Westmarch and the Thane's Book, and all of the ways in which the texts came down from the original authors to us, should be used in the prologue to the published Silmarillion. Do you see what that suggests? That Tolkien, at the time at least that he wrote that marginal note, clearly intended the Hobbit, the note on Shire records, this Hobbit textual genealogy, to be the frame of the Silmarillion explicitly. Exactly, Green Great Dragon. And the reason I say this is a bombshell to Christopher is, of course, as Christopher confessed and discussed very frankly and very honestly in The War of the Jewels and Morgoth's Ring, his choice, Christopher's choice, it was Christopher's choice to remove the frame. The Silmarillion always had a frame. And it was Christopher's choice to remove it. Now, look, he may have had no choice. Tolkien didn't write enough of it. And to have included it, he would have had to write a great deal of it himself. But this not only suggests that in Tolkien's mind, a published Silmarillion must have a preface and a frame, and must be set within the textual history of the Red Book of Westmarch and Bilbo's translations from the Elvish. But it also shows that Tolkien's own, and it tells us more about how that frame was supposed to work. That he had, Tolkien that is, had moved away from the original frame idea, which he was still flirting with very late. The original, the Alfwine frame. The medieval human dude gets in a ship, finds himself at Tolaresia, accidentally takes the narrow road, right? The straight road, and ends up in Tolaresia and learns all the stories and writes them down in Old English, obviously, like you would, and brings them back. And that's how that's how we got the stories, right? That version of the frame was there from the Book of Lost Tales, and it never totally went away. Remember, we got in later versions, remember the Ainulindale stuff that we were getting in, I think it was Morgoth's Ring? When we were getting late versions of the Ainulindale. This is post Lord of the Rings drafting of the Ainulindale. And he was still using a frame of Pingoloth speaking to a human, like telling the story to a human. And yet, here, now when he's finished writing The Lord of the Rings, in one of his copies of the first edition of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien wrote, "I've decided against including the note on Shire records in The Lord of the Rings. It belongs to the preface to the Silmarillion." So I think he had decided against the Alfwine frame. Not only that he wanted a frame, he wanted a Hobbit frame. He wanted the published Silmarillion to be Bilbo Baggins's translations from the Elvish. Kind of amazing, right? I wasn't exaggerating. It's a bombshell, right? I mean, that's something. That's something. And it's so easy to miss, Jackie. I never noticed this before either. I was making slides before class and was like, holy cow. Holy cow. Now, it's not clear when that bit was written, Tirathon, but it's clearly after it's written in the first edition, so it's after the first edition came out, and it's before the second edition came out because the note on Shire records, in fact, was included in the second edition of The Lord of the Rings. So sometime in between is when he wrote that. In other words, right in the middle of when he was writing all that stuff that we've been reading in Morgoth's Ring and War of the Jewels. No, Jackie, this was afterwards. This is after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. This is the first edition of The Lord of the Rings he's writing in. Yeah. So it's not when he, however, do keep in mind, though it's it's like wickedly complicated, and I'm not going to try to include that. All of that retcon stuff and the revision of The Hobbit and that same time, 1948 to 1950, when he's revising the end of The Lord of the Rings and he's revising the prologue and he's working on the appendices and he's, and the new version of chapter 5 is spontaneously showing up in the second edition of The Hobbit, is the time when he was flirting with HarperCollins and trying to get them to publish the Silmarillion with it too. Yeah. But anyway, yeah. So, yeah, James Christopher does allude to his, to the Hobbit frame in the introduction to Book of Lost Tales, Volume 1. And that is Christopher, right after this sentence, cites those pages of the Book of Lost. He's like, I talked about this in the Book of Lost Tales, Volume 1. And he just leaves it, right? Doesn't discuss it anymore. He's like, I talked about this, but he does not emphasize its significance. And I think it's really significant. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. How about that? Right. We learned a lot today in talking about the prologue. So we're going to keep going. Next time, let's see. Where are we? I forgot how long the next chapters are. So let me just take a quick glance at our table of contents here. Next, we have the appendix on languages. Oh, that'll do. Good grief. Yeah, that's 65 pages long. I think. Yeah. So let's look at the appendix. Oh, it's got some of the family trees and stuff in it too. Yeah, I did not decide on a stopping place. No, hang on. Sorry, I accidentally flipped ahead to the family trees chapter. Okay. Yeah, the appendix on languages is super long. I don't know how much detail I'm going to go into here, but we'll see. I'm going to keep doing what I was doing here tonight. That is just going through and picking out bits that strike me as raising really interesting questions. Even if we don't necessarily have answers to those questions. So read chapter 2. We're certainly not going to get past chapter 2 next time, and I make no promises that we're going to discuss the whole thing. But we might do more. So no. It's the sorry, I just had the page open. So chapter 2, the appendix on languages, is what we're reading. So no, that goes up to like page 84. Any of that is theoretically free, like fair game for our next discussion. So see how you do. There. Yeah, we're definitely not going to get through all of it. So if you only get through the first half, and I'm going to plan to pretty much talk about it in order. Yeah, it's complicated, Rebecca, as you say. There's like lots of notes and commentaries and things that you got to flip to and everything. So we'll see how we do. But that chapter is the chapter that we will discuss. If you can get through the whole thing, awesome. If not, try to read the first half or so, and we'll probably do that. All right. Awesome. Thank you, everybody. And I will see you guys next week. Bye now.